Thank you. Welcome to this informal meeting for members of 12-step fellowships who are interested in recovery through the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous. My name is Alistair and I'm an alcoholic. To set the tone for the meeting, I will read an extract from the preface of the big book. Because this book has become the basic text for our society and has helped such a large number of alcoholic men and women to recovery, there exists strong sentiments against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume, describing the AA recovery program, has been left largely untouched in the course of revisions made for the second, third and fourth editions. The section called The Doctor's Opinion has been kept intact, just as it was originally written in 1939 by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, our society's great medical benefactor. At tonight's workshop, we will start at chapter 4, We Agnostics, on page 44 of the big book. And Tim will work through the text paragraph by paragraph, pausing for questions. If you have a question, please use the raised hand function in Zoom, or you can message me through the chat function and I will ask Tim directly. We will try to close around the hour mark. And with that, I will hand over to Tim.
Good evening, everyone. Tim, alcoholic. So, we agnostics. In the preceding chapters, I love this. It says you've learned something of alcoholism after this immensely detailed, pretty comprehensive description. You've learned something of alcoholism. Anyway, we hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. Clearly not clearly enough, because they're about to tell you in case you missed it. This makes me laugh. So I think I mentioned before, step one being like two fields with a turnstile at the end of the first field to gain entrance to the second, and a turnstile at the end of the second field. So the turnstile at the end of the first field is earlier on when it says, basically, if you have the physical craving when you drink, the real problem is going to be why you have the first drink in the first place. And with Sponse C, you've got to make sure they're clear that there is no such thing as a safe drink. And when they drink buckets. Because only if that is true, is it relevant to discuss why you have the first drink in the first place. And here it picks up the first point and adds a second. And this is, as it were, the second turnstile to get out of step one into step two. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, that's mental obsession. Or if, when drinking, you have little control over the amount you take, physical craving, you're probably alcoholic. Footnote, when it says probably alcoholic, don't forget it's a stylistic device of this book to hedge statements so they're not absolute. If you say, in almost every case, you need a higher power, then the existence of one case where a higher power isn't necessary does not disprove your assertion. If you say a higher power is required in every case, a single case, counterexample, is enough to defeat your proposal. So it's very skillful, this hedging. The absolute statements tend to be when they quote third parties talking about AA, they let them be absolute, like the Johns Hopkins doctor on page 43. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which you may be suffering. You see, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. This way, by the way, they're avoiding provoking unnecessary argument, which is one of their stated purposes on page, was it 9, something like 19. Now, there's an interesting point here, and it's this or. Now, if I'm condemned to drink, but when I drink, I can control the amount, no problemo. If I can avoid if I drink buckets, but I can successfully avoid the first drink through willpower and self-knowledge, no problemo. So really, to be an alcoholic, you have to have both. That's the truth of it. Now, they've cast the net wide to capture people that identify with one or the other. Now, I've heard I've heard conflicting stories about this. Mark Houston and Joe Hawke quote Oscar and Oscar Weiss, who apparently was one of the first 100. I'm just quoting them here. Who said that, yes, they put that in there as a so-called drunk trap. There being a number of these through the book to catch people out, to get people to reveal what they actually think. I'm skeptical of that, frankly. I've only heard it from one source, and especially long after the event, people's reports can be very inaccurate. But I will report one thing. I've gone through step 1 with sponsees, where all the way through chapters 2 and 3, are you like this? Oh, yes, I'm just like that. All the way chapter 3, are you like this? Oh, yes, I'm just like that. And you think, well, home dry with this sunshine. This is very good. Absolutely. Alcoholic? Yes. And then you say, right, do you comply with this test? If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking, you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably alcoholic. Now, what I've seen more than one person do is see that test, realize that they can pass the test just by saying yes to one of the 2 questions. Just like in an exam, when they say answer one of the following questions, you only have to write 1 essay. They think you can pass the test, you can get over the hurdle by saying yes to 1, therefore it's safe to admit to my sponsor that I don't subscribe to the other point. I can still get through with room to spare. And it turns out, when you put it as bluntly as that question with the or, not the and, a number of people have conceded, that's not even the right word. They've blithely disclosed by accident the fact they don't buy one of those 2 propositions. Oh yeah, when I drink a lot, when I drink a lot, but I can stay away, I can stay away from it, but I want to do the steps because my life's a mess. They don't believe they've got the mental obsession. Or the same is true on the other side. They think they can control the amount, but they keep going back and having the first drink. And so what it does, it does very cleverly. I don't know if it's intentionally though. It does very clever in operations clever. It brings out people's reservations, and at that point you've got to look at those reservations, because they'll come up and bite you on the proverbial. Almost sort of bad word there. They'll come and bite you on the proverbial, and I'll tell you why. If you don't believe you have to do the rest of what's in this book to save your actual life, push is going to come to shove at some point, particularly if you're capable in the outside world and you're good at getting jobs and careers and self-importance and clothes and other interesting things. AA is not going to look as interesting after a while. If at core, you have to do it because you're jiggered, otherwise it changes the game completely. To one who feels he is an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible, but to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. Now, I've got a problem here, because we've got these dreaded words, atheist and agnostic, which are terms which are open to differing definitions. People are very fond of dictionaries at various points. I think what is more indicative of what the authors meant is other things the authors themselves have said about such matters. That's going to get you closer, because what you're interested in is not any abstract meaning. What you're interested in, did the cat just turn John's microphone on? That's so funny. You're not interested in what the dictionary says. You're interested in what Bill meant. Now, the dictionary may help you get there. I'm pretty sure Bill says in the 12 and 12, it's not the 12 and 12, it's somewhere else. His understanding of the atheist is someone who believes they can disprove the existence of God. They can prove the non-existence of God. So someone who believes they have conclusive proof of the non-existence of God. An agnostic is someone who's in between, doesn't know. And then there's someone that believes in God. Now, his definition of atheist doesn't quite jive, as they say, with what most people understand to be an atheist. Most people that I've met who profess atheism, so they don't say, I can prove the non-existence of God, because it's very difficult to prove a negative. But what they do tend to say is, I have no evidence for the existence of God, which is not the same logically as I can prove the non-existence of God. And the agnostic, is Evan here? Evan is our resident. Oh, he's not here. Is he here?
Of course I'm here.
Oh, there you are. I couldn't see you on the screen. Evan, am I right in thinking that the proper sense of agnostic is someone who claims that the existence of God is unknowable?
Right. It's Gnostics have whatever, are knowing, and they don't know by definition. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not knowing, and also I think a subset of that is people who claim that whether or not God exists is fundamentally unknowable. That so statements about the existence or non-existence of God are unknowable. So this is Bill's point of view. Is you've got someone who can prove the non-existence of God. He's got a funny view of atheists we'll come to later on, which is problematical with a lot of sponsees. And then we've got this agnostic in the middle. Now, in practice, my experience with sponsees is they largely fall into the following classes. There are people who are absolutely baffled at the notion that there might be a God, absolutely convinced there isn't one there. There can't be one. There's no evidence. There's no more evidence for God than there is for space aliens or anything else. That's an awful lot of people, usually clothed with a good old dose of anti-clericalism in there as well, and quite a dose of contempt for religion. You got some flip-floppy people in the middle who say one thing one day and another thing another day. You've got people who are open to the idea, and they're the easiest to deal with. People open to the idea, never really considered it before, but like totally open to the idea. The people who 6 weeks previously were, they saw something on Facebook which said that the reason they're in a bad mood was because there was Mercury in retrograde, and they wrote, yes, totally my experience. And then, they're open to this as well. So open-mindedness can have it can be a very good thing at times. It can, like, crazy open-mindedness can come in super useful when you get to step 2, because these people just cave. Then you've got people that I think the hardest lot are the people who are very religious in a sort of they like all the churchy stuff, or the outer garb of a religion, but it's not really penetrated. They're still the masters or mistresses of their own life, and religion is one aspect, the way they manage their life and they manage their world, and that's a very difficult class of people. So that's just to set out the stall of what we're dealing with in practice, and also the stall of how Bill's arguments are going to be presented. This is a very difficult chapter. I still find it's a very difficult chapter. So if I'm a bit all over the place and unsystematic and unstructured, then I'm giving a disclaimer in advance. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live life on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. Now, there are lots of theories about this line. On the face of it, it's a no-brainer. So you can either die or you can live life on a spiritual basis. Should not be difficult. If it is difficult, then usually what is happening is you've got someone who believes there is an invisible third option that hasn't been listed here. So the disagreeable spiritual life, the disagreeability of spiritual life is enough to count it out, because there is something else. What else could you do? You could hang around in AA, you could have a therapist, You could talk to your pals in AA, you can go for fellowship, get a social life sober, start to get your life sorted out. It's kind of how a lot of people do AA, and if it works, it's fine. So I think there's a middle ground that people are quietly believing in. So because the spiritual life is difficult, in my experience, you have to give up a lot of ideas and you have to give up a fair amount of time to actually live it. So the point is valid, but only because there's this invisible third option. Once you're down to the two options, I find people cave instantly when they're genuinely terrified of, and also to be doomed to an alcoholic death. I was talking to someone this, I think on here, no, they're not. It doesn't matter if they are, because it's not offensive to them at all. I was talking to someone this morning about step one. And we were talking about the notion of there's no such thing as a safe slip. And they said, yeah, I can absolutely see, like when I drink, like most of the time it's fine, but on occasion I do really dangerous stuff or stupid stuff. So there's no such thing as a safe slip. And that is part of it. So you might get really beaten up on the slip, but of course the real point, the image that we were talking about was, you know, they say in AA you can, it's a lift that goes down alcoholism, and you can get out on any floor. Except the point about there being no such thing as a safe slip is you can't guarantee that the lift is going to stop at any of the other floors. It could just keep on going and you can whiz past the floors and it doesn't stop. And in the lift, there are monsters who are sometimes pleasant and quiet and placid, but sometimes rip you to shreds. And you can't guarantee that they're not going to kill you before the lift doors open again. So that's the being doomed to an alcoholic death. It's like, when the image someone else gave me once, it's like if you set off into the desert with a canteen of water and someone has punctured the canteen of water so that the water will gradually dribble out without you realizing it, and you're going to die of thirst halfway across the desert. If the canteen hadn't been punctured, there would have been enough water to get across the desert. But because it's been punctured, the water dribbles out, you haven't got enough water to get through it and you die. Now what is the point that the murder is committed? Is it the point that the person actually dies of thirst, or is it the point at which the hole is punctured in the canteen? And of course, I think most of us probably agree that the point of no return is setting out with a canteen of water with a hole in it. And it's like that with drinking. Although it may be days, weeks, months, or years before death hits, the point at which you start drinking again may be the point of no return. Even though it looks as though technically you could come back, you can't. And once that's understood, this becomes a no-brainer question. Now, the reason why it's not, partly is because of this notion that there is a middle ground. Now, the reason people believe that, one's got to be charitable about this. The reason they believe that is because if you go to most AA meetings, most people, most of the time, are doing what will be called on page 58 half measures. They are doing some measures, but they're not doing full measures. A friend of mine was talking to a new sponsee who's 4 years sober with a previous sponsor, hadn't made any amends, made a couple of amends. And my friend said to him, but you haven't made your amends. And the bloke said, but I'm willing. But he hasn't made, he knows where they are. He's got their phone numbers, but he hasn't made the amends. Willingness without action is fantasy. But otherwise his program's pretty good in lots of meetings and talks to people and does a bit of step 11, but it's half measures. So this notion, on the face of it, if you look around AA, it looks like this is a badly posed question, that it's a false dichotomy, a false dilemma. There aren't really two options. There are three options. You can muddle along in the middle. You don't have to go all the way into a spiritual life, and you're not necessarily going to die. Now, that's true in the short and medium term. But as I've said before, what matters in the long term? What works over 10 years? What works over 20 years? What works over 30 years? And over a long period, a lot of people get picked off. You don't realize until you look back how many people have been picked off by alcoholism, like picked off like wolves picking animals, ailing animals from a pack. And it's a lot of people. When I look back at the home group that I went to in the early 90s, the people I know who are still sober from that and stayed sober continuously, so with no slips, are all kind of really hardcore program people. There isn't one who isn't, and I don't know anyone, maybe one person who wasn't hardcore who's made it, but he's kind of a sort of spiritual eccentric. So the middle ground is an illusion, and it's to be, I think, likened to being in a room in a house with multiple stories, and the floor seems stable, and it seems stable up until the point it gives way beneath you. But of course, by the time a floor is collapsing, it's too late to do anything about it. But it's stable up until the point it collapses. And that's the danger of the middle ground, is that it seems fine for a while. But it isn't so difficult. About half our original fellowship were exactly of that type. Or right, I suppose it should be those two types. It's atheist or agnostic. Anyway, at first some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while, we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life or else. And by the way, I think that applies sober. I mean, I'm not naturally cheerful. I'm really not. I struggle with all sorts of things. And I tell you, this week, this is just between you and me. No one else is going to get to hear this. Between you and me, this week, I've been reduced to working the AA program. It got that bad. I actually started taking a step, and I've been practicing step 3 a lot. I've been first thing in the morning, I say the step 3 prayer 30, 40 times over and over until the coffee's kicked in. And I've been saying it a lot during the day, and it's immediately solved the problem I thought I had. But I don't know about anyone else. I have to try everything else first. I have to try pretending there is nothing wrong for days, weeks, months, or years before I will face the fact I must find a spiritual basis for life. I will do anything but work the program. So I think this applies when dealing with the drinking problem, and it applies when dealing with everything else. I don't believe in God because I think it's right. I believe in God because I need to, and then it works, and then I think, I do believe in God really, but that's the way round. You jump in the lifeboat because it's the only thing available. You don't like lifeboats personally. Once you're in it, you're pretty glad it's there, and you start to trust it. It's all backwards. I'll tell you what it's like. Listen to Clancy about once a week. I think it's a really good thing to do. One of the things, if you like him, if you don't like him, then don't. But one of the things he says, it's like the invisible rowing boat. AA is like an invisible rowing boat. Someone's drowning, and a couple of goofs float by just above the surface of the water and say, "Do you want to get in our lifeboat?" And you're drowning. So there isn't a lifeboat there. And they said, "Yes, there is. Row." And you're like, "What do you mean, row? There aren't any oars." And they say, "Just row. Read our lips. Row." And you start rowing. And as you start rowing, you find yourself lifted above the water, and the rowing boat appears. So I started to believe in God when I started to take the actions which were correlative with that. I didn't start to believe in God first. So I think the purpose of this chapter is to get you to take the plunge, even though you're not fully convinced. Why? Because there is a fire chasing you from behind. Perhaps it is going to be that way with you, but cheer up. in one version of the big book I had, I don't know if you've gone through a highlighter phase. It's a phase you have to go through. So it's a tedious phase. Usually you get through it in a few months or years. Some people decades later, the highlighters are still out. But it has its uses. And one of the ways of doing it is you highlight the instructions, your statements about alcoholism, instructions, promises, warnings with different colors, and it's helpful. And I highlighted cheer up as an instruction. I took it as an instruction, and it seems like a ridiculous thing to do, but here's the thing. In the Just for Today card, which I think is an underused piece of AA resource, it says most people are about as happy as they make up their minds to be. And I think half the battle is making the decision, I'm going to be cheerful, and then to say, well, how am I going to do that? Rather than let's prove why I should be cheerful before I make the decision to be cheerful. It never works that way around. Have you ever tried to help someone who's unhappy? They call you up and they say, I want you to help me. And you try and say helpful things and you think you're helping. And they argue with your reasons for looking at things differently. And you think there's something funny going on here. You have to decide to cheer up first before any cheering measures will cheer you. If you haven't decided to cheer up, they'll just annoy you. As Tom Weston says about Al-Anon, if you think you might need to go to Al-Anon, hold out for as long as you can. Just hold on and hold out. When you have to go, you'll have to go, but don't go before you're completely ready. So don't cheer up unless you're really, really miserable and can't face it anymore. Something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics. Patronizing. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life was sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral, we could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. Now, this gets misunderstood, in my view, I might be wrong, people understand this as dismissing morals somehow and dismissing having a philosophy of life. So there's that wonderful slogan, keep it simple, stupid, which is not one of my favorite ones. And that comes out of that sort of tradition. So don't think about things, just do. I don't think that's their view here. I think their view is you need to have a moral code and you do need to have a philosophy of life, but they won't be enough on their own. So they're necessary. It's not that they're unnecessary. Human aid not being enough doesn't mean that you don't need human aid. It just means human aid on its own is not enough. Doesn't mean you shouldn't think. It's just thinking on its own is not enough. And I think the reason why this is the case is when I'm identified with my ego, my primary allegiance is to that. So the philosophy and the code of morals aren't powerful enough to bite on their own. It's about law of substitution. So the spiritual law of substitution, where to get rid of something out of your mind, you have to replace it with something else. So one has to replace the allegiance to the ego with an allegiance to something else. You can't have an allegiance to nothing. If you try and have an allegiance to nothing, the ego just gets sucked back in. There's nature. To that even if you can live practically in accordance with the code of morals or the better philosophy of life, I mean, my experience is that I can I can do that, but the voices in my head which make me unhappy are louder than any experience I have in the outside world. So we need, by the way, with sponsees, to get them to test this one out. So is the code of morals or philosophy sufficient? You test it out with this one. My father, when I was growing up, if anyone expressed worry, he'd say, I don't know why you're worrying about it. It might never happen. This is true. The worry did not change anything. It might never happen. This never removed anyone's anxiety. And you take the principle of the idea of resentment as well, that when you point out to someone, say your resentment, does your resentment change any of the bad circumstances that you are resentful about? No. Has your resentment now abated? No. It is just as strong as it was before I had that wise realization. And it doesn't take long to come up with a whole list of examples of situations where knowing what is true does not help. It doesn't get rid of it. So John said, acknowledging they are not sufficient on their own, are there some philosophies that are better than others? If so, which ones work alongside AA? You think I'm going to say that on a tape? Some people actually seem to get by just with homespun AA. That seems to work very well with a lot of people. I think that gets me about 95% of the way there. The guide on page 87, it talks about prayers. You say set prayers which emphasize the principles we've been discussing. So that, I think that answers the question. One gets to try it out for oneself. I found Stoicism to fit in an American, in terms of philosophy, American pragmatism, to fit in very, very well with the AA program. But people have all sorts of different experiences. So I know an alcoholic lady in Long Island who's wonderful, who's got a very sort of soupy, sentimental Catholicism, and that totally works for her. I mean, I'd get diabetes within 2 minutes of trying that out because it's so sort of sugary. I can't. And you know, people talk about very sentimentally about sort of God as a person that's with them, and that's absolutely not my bag at all. But people seem to be able to fit it to anything. I'll tell you two stories. I don't know. I think it's in one of AA's own history books. So the word history has to be in inverted commas there. AA history books. There are external histories of AA which are probably a little more reliable as far as the facts are concerned, but AA's internal history books have got some use. And there's a description of where they presented the steps to some leading Buddhist authorities in Thailand who gave their blessing to it. And there's a story which may be apocryphal where the AA program was presented to the spiritual leaders of one of the Native American tribes, and the response was something. I think this comes from a Don Quixote story. I may be wrong. And the response came back, yeah. So the 12 steps are like totally compatible with Native American religion. I think it may have been Lakota. I may be wrong on that. And they said, first of all, they must have got it from us because it's so close to what we believe. And secondly, they got it wrong because they wrote the steps in a sequence, whereas they should be in a circle. So the 12 should come back to one, but otherwise knock yourself out. So people seem to do well with all sorts of things. Oh gosh, I'm going to say something frightfully controversial. I've seen, now this is not representative of this particular brand of religion. I've seen people get themselves into trouble in AA by deciding that the higher power is necessarily Jesus and no one else is going to get sober unless they get Jesus. And that can be that happens. That situation arises on a not infrequent basis in East London. People pop up and there are difficulties there. But that's got nothing to do with the compatibility of the philosophy. It's got to do, I think, may have to do with dynamics of particular forms of particular religions. But no, I think anything seems to work. And yes, Evan says, anyone who wants good starting books in Stoicism, feel free to message me. Good. So what's next? Lack of power. That was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how were we to find this power? Okay, so what does this mean? Lack of power is the dilemma. All through the book, and this is a very helpful pairing, it talks about a combination of two resources being required, the first one being direction and the second one being power, which can be likened to a map or a programmed satellite navigation system and petrol in the engine. If you've just got the map, you're not going to get anywhere unless you have fuel. And the suggestion here is that oh yes, so for anyone interested in an AA comparison to the Native American story, so he's got some information on that, which is, so message him if you want more information about that. There's a very good Don Coy's book about with meditations, daily meditations, 365 of them for COYHIS. Meditations based on Native American religion. I find it terribly interesting, rather wonderful. Anyway, lack of power. So information is not enough. We need power. Information stroke direction is not enough. We need power. This can be likened, if you want an image, particularly with sponsees, you can have all the ingredients for the soup you like. Unless there's heat under the pot, you ain't going to have soup, you're going to have ingredients. So that's the distinction between, the qualitative distinction between information and power. Power is this almost invisible thing which makes the ingredients come to life, which makes the instructions and the information directions come to life. Now, I think the key to this chapter, I'm probably preempting some of the material. When going through this with sponsees, so I say particularly in Britain, I know not everyone here is in Britain, but people, in my experience, as was I, are very sniffy about religion, generally. Generally not very well educated about it, and there's an awful lot of contempt and prejudice. And I think it's terribly useful. I go in with this notion of a power greater than ourselves, which is synonymous with higher power, but a power greater than ourselves is the best starting point with sponsees. So greater than what? If we say our aim, our substantive aim is twofold. Number one, to stay sober. Number two, to thrive sober. So to stay sober and thrive sober. The two things I might need are direction and power, or if you want a little cute pair of words, wit and wherewithal. Wit and wherewithal. And you say to the person, right, have you got the wit and wherewithal to stay sober and thrive sober? And the answer is, well, no, otherwise you wouldn't be sponsoring. Then you point out people in your home group. Well, first of all, you actually posit, if there were a power greater than yourself, it would necessarily be a power which has got more wit and wherewithal than you have on your own. So that would be the definition. A power greater than myself is that which would enable me to stay sober and thrive. And what you then do, this is the sleight of hand here. I'm sure there's some fallacy buried in it somewhere, but it seems to work. You say, look at Susan over there. So Susan has been sober for 17 years, and she's cheerful, and she's got her own business, and you know, she knits, and there's everything's going well. You say, do you recognize that Susan is A, sober, and B, thriving? Yes. Don't use yourself as, you may not be the best. I'm not always the best example of the AA program. Always point other people who are doing well. They're better examples than you. So you say, okay, Susan's doing well. Have you heard Susan's story? Yes, I've heard Susan's story. Do you recognize that Susan was in the position you're in, that she was without the wit and wherewithal to stay sober and thrive? Yes, good. So do you concede, little sponsee, that Susan has accessed a power greater than her own wit and wherewithal, which enables her to do something she couldn't do on her own? Yes, Susan has a power greater than herself. So is there a power greater than Susan? And at this point, they use that wonderful line. Well, when you put it that way, yes, I do put it that way. So is there a power greater than Susan? Yes, there is a power greater than Susan. The only question now is, which is greater, you or the power greater than Susan? Are you able to bring about sobriety and the ability to thrive in another human being? No, you can't even do it in yourself. So this power, which is greater than Susan, is greater than you. And a head-to-head, who helps Susan more? Susan's higher power or you? Or Susan's higher power? Well, welcome to your new higher power. This higher power, we only know one thing about it, which is that it's greater than Susan and therefore greater than you. So that's your new, so whatever is keeping Susan sober and helping her to thrive is available to you too. And it's very difficult. No one's ever successfully argued against that one. Now, what's good about this approach is that it completely bypasses questions of whether, you know, those parasites which burrow through people's eyes in Africa are evidence of there being no loving God in the universe. One completely bypasses those, and you use poor old Susan as your sort of exhibit A. But Anne Lamott says this. She went to a pastor and said, do you believe in God, and do you think I should believe in God, and blah blah blah. And he said, look at yourself, you are exhibit A for the proposal that there is a power greater than yourself. And then all you have to do, so there is something keeping people sober in AA and helping them thrive. And the rest of the chapter is going to be about demonstrating, well, if it works for them, it's a reasonable assumption that it will work for you. That's the structure of this. And what you get people to do is you get them to take the word God, detach it from all the old ideas they have about God, and attach it to the power that helps Susan stay sober and thrive. So now God is a code word for that which keeps Susan sober, and Bobby and Andy and everyone else. If it's in America, they will be called Taylor and Chad and Madison. So change the names according to the country. Once you've got that, you're, as it were, cooking with gas with someone. And now you've got a working, because what you have now is a working model of a higher power that someone can start to rely on. So then it becomes a very simple matter to say, well, if you do what Susan did to establish a relationship with that higher power, then you can have the same results too. And then it says, where and how were we to find this power? Well, that's exactly what this book is about. And this relieves a lot of pressure. So the proposal is that if you take the ideas in this book and run with them, and then take the actions, the finding of the power greater than yourself will automatically happen. You don't need to think up anything outside this book. It's all in there. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. Singular, interesting. I think the problem is the ego. So it gives an alternative guidance and power system to the ego. That means we've written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. So it's not moral. It is moral, but it's spiritual as well. So it's about one's relationship to the universe. So not just about a code of behavior or a code of belief, but it touches the sort of metaphysical question of, am I the center of my universe, or am I an instrument of something else which is the center of the universe? I think that's essentially the moral side of it. Then the moral and the spiritual overlap, but that's the distinction if there is one. And it means, of course, that we're going to talk about God. Here, difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope rise as we discuss his alcoholic problems and explain our fellowship. His face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God, for we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. We know how he feels. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. Some of us have been violently anti-religious. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea of him with which someone had tried to impress them during childhood. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. We were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power great beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. We looked upon this world of warring individuals, warring theological systems, and inexplicable calamity with deep skepticism. We looked askance at many individuals who claimed to be godly. How could a supreme being have anything to do with it at all? And who could comprehend a supreme being anyhow? Yet, in other moments, we found ourselves thinking, when enchanted by a starlit night, who then made all of this? There was a feeling of awe and wonder, but it was fleeting and soon lost. Now, there are a couple of difficulties with this paragraph. Bill introduces piecemeal theological ideas all through this chapter. Now, when Bill is talking about alcoholism in chapter 3, you kind of have to take it at face value. You kind of have to take it as a package deal. You can't really do canteen style. I think this is the chapter where you can be just as far ahead with the canteen style approach. You adopt as much as helps, but don't feel you have to swallow the bits which don't. So there are two aspects to this paragraph. First of all, there are different objections people have. And secondly, there are other ideas which Bill is suggesting, as I say, which are theological in nature, which may or may not help. And I want to deal with those separate. They're quite separate topics. So you've got this anti-religious thing. So you've got people's problems with the ecclesiastical structures of, the church or something. Something Tom W. says is, if you've got resentment against the Catholic Church, fine. But I want names, I want dates, I want places. Isolate who your charge is really against. Maybe something terrible happened. If something terrible happened, point the charge at the person who is responsible, the people who are responsible, not the abstract structure. And I think that's a very helpful way of starting to process that. But we're in step 2, not step 4. So that's got to be set aside. It's got to be parked over there. I don't know if I mentioned Cormac Murphy O'Connor before. I don't think I have. He was a prominent British Catholic, and they say a broken clock is right twice a day. He said, I shouldn't really said about poor old soul, but he said, I've never met someone who believes, what was it? I've never met an atheist who disbelieves. Oh no, I'm not going to get this right now. Let's say I've never met anyone who believes in the God that atheists that I've met say they disbelieve. So to unpack that, basically what he's saying is a lot of descriptions people will have of the God they don't believe in is not a God that people generally believe in anyway. Good example. A few weeks ago, there was someone that said, well, I don't believe in the man in the sky on the cloud. And I'm like, pumpkin, no one does. They really don't. It's, you know, the talk to some Christians, that they actually, they'll all conceive of it. You're not going to get the straight answer. But the point is, people have successfully rejected particular conceptions as inadequate, but they have. Now, what's interesting here, it says, with that rejection, we imagine we had abandoned the God idea entirely. It's not quite right. People have held on to the image of the God they don't believe in. And it's because they're holding on to that image, they feel they've abandoned the God idea entirely. So I think the job, and I think I mentioned this before, you get people to write out everything they think God is, and then you get them to rip it up or burn it and start it with a fresh sheet of paper. If you try and unpick the existing beliefs, you'll be there until doomsday. If you start with a blank sheet of paper, and you build up from almost nothing, you can get a working version of a higher power up and running in a few minutes. So I'll give you an example. Again, it's a Tom story. A woman who didn't believe in God and went to AA for a year. It worked. She surrendered to AA, but she didn't have a higher power in her conception. Whether you've got one has got nothing to do with whether you think you've got one. That's one of the interesting things about it, in my view. Anyway, when she was a year sober, she'd done most of her drinking sitting in a green armchair in her living room. And when she was sober for a year, she was hoovering and she realized she hadn't sat in the green armchair in the whole time she'd been sober in AA. And it struck her, aha, so the higher power is that which keeps me out of the green armchair. That's my new higher power. So it was defined very, very simply from the most basic. That's the only thing she knows about it. It keeps her out of the green armchair. And this isn't silly. This sounds like a silly story. What a silly woman. She's not at all. There's a perfectly respectable trend in, or trend is the wrong word, stream running through the history of philosophy where people doubt everything beyond immediate experience. And she's reducing, she's saying, I can't know beyond immediate experience. What I know is I haven't sat in the green chair where I drink. So something is causing that to happen. And I think that's it's a very rational, a very sound idea. It's the opposite of silly, and it's sufficient. That's the other thing. As an explanatory abstraction, it's perfectly sufficient. So what do you do with people? You sidestep the the warring theological systems. I'll come to you in a second, Alistair. You sidestep all of those things, and also hypocrites. It talks about that somewhere here. Oh yes, we look to scans, such a good word, at many individuals who claim to be godly. And of course, a failure of someone to adequately implement a system doesn't invalidate the system. It says something about them. So that can be easily dealt with. But basically, you're going to have to leave a lot of that stuff until step 4, but you need to get a working definition of God. I'm just going to finish this paragraph before I come to you, Alistair. On the positive side, you see Bill, I think it's clever, but it's tricky. He's introducing notions. So he's saying you can have any higher power you want, but here are some ideas you can play with. And then people react to the ideas and then react to the chapter. So what I do as sponsors, I say, if a term bothers you and you're just allergic to it because of all of its associations and connotations, even its denotation, ignore that. Don't worry about it. Set it aside. So if you see supreme being and you stick up a little bit in your mouth, let it go. You don't have a problem with the notion of a higher power. You don't have a problem with God. You have a problem with Bill's conception of God, and Bill is dead. And hectoring at him is not going to change anything. And similarly, who then made all of this. You know, the notion that God is that which created the physical universe is one view in the history of philosophy and theology. It ain't the only one, Bill. So again, if the idea of a God who created the physical universe is problematical for you, there's no problem. So this is what I mean about canteen style. You can take the individual ideas in this chapter and you use what is helpful, ignore what is not, as long as you come out of it at the end. If you can come out of it at the end saying, I don't have the answer to my life. You're offering me a system which is going to give me some really good direction and a means of establishing, a means of flicking the switch and having power flow to be able to actually live it. I'm on board. As long as you come out of the chapter with that, you're good. Alistair, you had a question.
Thanks, Tim. My question was really about, I mean, the paragraph is basically discussing someone who's perhaps anti-religious or rejected, certainly the idea of God. If you had any experience on someone who perhaps hasn't rejected religion, who is actually religious, but and how do you convey this chapter, or what do you, yeah, what's your experience with someone who is perhaps very religious?
I've had people say, well, I believe in God and I go to church and all that. But I think it's, as I said earlier, that it's the problem. A friend of mine, my friend James, said that drunk and hungover on a Sunday morning, you go to church and be incredibly moved by the incense and the music and these sort of great big tears of sincere contrition would roll down his face. Then you go to the pub and have another pint. So I think this is where I would make this distinction, and I hate doing it, but I think it's necessary, between religion and spirituality, and say, let's not touch the religion side of things. Let's look at your relationship, your personal relationship with this higher power that you have. What does that look like? To what extent do you really turn your will and life over to the higher power? The converse of that is being full of self-will. And a very helpful paragraph is the first paragraph in the St. Augustine prayer book, Sacraments of Penance. Now, there are lots of frightening words in that little clause, that little phrase there, the St. Augustine prayer book, Sacraments of Penance. But the definition of pride in there, and definition, in fact, of all of the character defects, I think is genius. And pride is described as the putting of self in the place of God as the center and main objective of my life or of some department thereof. My refusal to recognize my status as creature placed in a specific relationship by God with the rest of the universe. It's a bit of a mouthful, but basically, who's the center of your life? Is it you or is it God? And how does that play out in your relationships? And the conversation is then over in 5 to 10 minutes. People typically get straight away, yeah, the religion is there, as it were, but there's still a lot of self-will. The advantage, I'd say, over the course of all my sponsees, although there can be little sort of hard nuts to crack with the religious side of things, certainly with some religions in particular, the extent of religious training means that people they're kind of softened up for the whole notion of a spiritual program. They may not have been doing it terribly well, but the fundamental objection isn't there. And also the materialism is often not in the way. There's already an understanding that materialism for them is not the be all and end all of life, that there are other values. They just haven't been able to access and implement them successfully. So all in all, although there can be some very tricky problems with the very religious, once you get over those, the rest of it is much more plain sailing, in my experience. although there are a couple of people here that might have had different experiences, you know who you are. So anyway, it's 8 o'clock, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm sorry everyone I didn't get through more than 2.5 pages. So there we have it. That's it from me.
Thanks, Tim. So what page was it that we were on? 45. Bottom of 45. Okay, that's where we'll pick it up next week. I will drop in.
I think it's 46 actually. It was fleeting and soon lost.
Okay. Page 46. I will now drop in into the chat a link which will take you to the recordings of these meetings and the previous recordings, and hopefully the recording of this one will be up there in the coming days. And with that, I will hand back to Tim to ask you to take us out the usual way.
Thank you. Would you please help me close with the serenity prayer? God, grant me the serenity to accept things I cannot change, courage to change things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Thank you, Tim.
See you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.